Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to the 35th episode of A Couple Takes on MS. Hi, this is Dan Digman.
And hi, this is me, Jennifer Digman.
Welcome, and thanks for tuning in. Just a quick background for those who haven't listened to us before or those who have. Just a quick reminder, this is Dan, and I have relapsing remitting MS, and Jennifer, my wife.
Yes, I am Dan's wife, and I have secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And both Dan and I have been living with the disease for, I've been 20 years, and Dan's at 18 years. So I feel like we're pretty wise when it comes to multiple sclerosis.
And we've been married for 12 and a half years, and wow.
I wish we had a horn like on Bozo, the clown show.
Yeah.
Because when you said 12 and a half years, I'd be like, honk, honk. You know, like, surprise.
Surprise, yay.
Or congratulations, yay, go us.
Well, and with this show, it's like a couple takes on MS, so obviously we're a couple, but then we're, looking at MS from different perspectives, either relapsing or with Jennifer with secondary progressive. What we're talking about today, and it deals with wheelchairs, and I walk, Jennifer can't walk, and I think one of the questions one of the things that's always said when somebody's newly diagnosed or people who have MS, there's always the phrase of just saying, I'm afraid I will end up in a wheelchair.
I think the wheelchair is probably the biggest fear that most people have when they're diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Wouldn't you agree?
I think that, and that is, because, obviously we've had it 18, 20 years respectively, but just, I think that is the fear we always have. It's like, gosh, I could become disabled. I might not be able to walk anymore. Did you ever fear, Jennifer, that you would end up in a wheelchair?
Absolutely. That was my biggest fear. I remember being diagnosed back in 1997, and it was Annette Funicello. Do you remember her?
I remember the Musketeer.
Yes, from the Mickey Mouse.
Or I guess it'd be Mouseketeer.
Mouseketeer.
Yes.
Mouseketeer. And she was diagnosed, and I remember later in her life she used a wheelchair, and it was something where you pitied her, like, oh, poor Annette, she's using a wheelchair. And so I was afraid that my MS would progress to the point where I could no longer walk. So that was a fear, definitely.
And so then the question now, here, 20 years, I guess the question, how long till after you were diagnosed did you have to start using a wheelchair?
It's about 5 years after my diagnosis. My disease was fairly aggressive, and I went through, because think about it, I was diagnosed in 97. So back in the late 90s, there were only 3 treatment options for multiple sclerosis. You had the ABCs, Avonex, Betaseron, and Copaxone. And that was your treatment options. And I went through the A and the B, and then until I eventually wound up on the C, and I did pretty well, and I'm appreciative to Copaxone because it kept my MS quiet, but not quiet, so quiet that I didn't lose the ability to walk.
And so then I guess...
Yeah, and it was about 5 years after my diagnosis. If I didn't answer your question, sorry. About 5 years after my diagnosis, I started using it became necessary for me to use a wheelchair.
And I think this is something, and for everybody out there listening, think about this. Are you afraid that you will end up, quote unquote, end up in a wheelchair? And I think now that I've had it for 18 years, and now that I have a wife who uses a wheelchair, every now and then I get I want to say upset, or it frustrates me, or I'm thinking it's kind of insulting when people say, oh, I don't want to end up in a wheelchair, because when people say that, or you hear people say that, are you offended? Does it hurt you? I mean, because do you feel like you're the person that people are afraid of becoming?
Well, I think definitely I embody the fear that most people have. I mean, just as I'm gonna ask you, Dan, and then I'll answer the question a little better. But were you afraid that you would end up in a wheelchair when you were diagnosed?
Yeah. I mean, I was.
Are you still afraid that your MS will progress?
Well, that's not a fair question, Jennifer.
Sorry,
no,
babe.
no. I think because on that level, I think it's apples to oranges in some senses. Because yeah, when I was first diagnosed, I was afraid I would quote, and we use that loosely, or just end up in a wheelchair.
Right.
I was afraid. However, am I afraid now? Yes, but for totally different reasons. Because I end up in a wheelchair now, I'm not the only one who's impacted by that. You lose your primary caregiver if that happens to me. So that's my fear as far as for me living. And this is the thing, and I think what we try to do, or what you try to do, is to make it, to show it that if you quote unquote end up in a wheelchair is not the end of your life and independence.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you want to air quote, I ended up in a wheelchair 5 years after my diagnosis. Well, since I ended up in my wheelchair, I met a very handsome man.
Really, what's his name?
Haha, that would be you, smart guy. And then I got married.
Mm-hmm.
I moved into my own house with my husband. And you and I got our graduate degrees. We have this blog that we manage. We have a radio show. We've traveled. I mean, I've had more opportunities than I think I ever would have had, because I take my life a little more seriously and I appreciate things. And I have a great amount of help, and I know that. But the multiple sclerosis, and you and I have both said this, it kind of put our lives into focus. But the wheelchair, I mean, I ended up in a wheelchair, and that's hard because I never wanted that. I mean, there are some definite disadvantages to being in a wheelchair, but if you have to rely on one for mobility, it gives me so much independence. And that's why it irks me to no end when people say things like, oh, she's confined to a wheelchair. Oh, that poor person is, stuck in a wheelchair. It's like this wheelchair, this chair gives me so much independence. Because without it, I would never be able to do any of what I've done. And so that's like where I want a T-shirt that has wheelchair and like independence, like a flag hanging off of it. Like, that's my independence, because I really see it that way.
Okay, so then thinking back, because I think hopefully through this conversation, people will see that, do people need to be more sensitive when using things, or the thought or comments about, I'm afraid I would end up in a wheelchair? Or do you think that it's up to people who use wheelchairs, people like you, to show that it's not?
I think people are more sensitive now, But it is a legitimate concern. I mean, if I wasn't in a wheelchair, if it was you, I would likely say, oh, I'm afraid I'll end up in a wheelchair. And hopefully for the same reasons that you said, that would change the dynamic of our relationship. And I think potentially, I hope, and this could be naive, but people feel comfortable saying things like, oh, I'm afraid I'll end up in a wheelchair around me because they kind of forget that I'm in a wheelchair.
And is that a good thing that they forget because they don't see you? They don't see your wheel.
They see me and not my chair, which I think is awesome. Or another thing is they're honest with me. It is a big fear because let's be frank, a wheelchair, yes, it gives you independence, but it limits quite a bit of things. It's not like I'm ever potentially, not that I ever would, but I'm going to go skydiving. It's not like I can go out for long drives or walks hand in hand with you on the beach because a wheelchair and sand don't mix.
Provided the beach, the beaches can, and I think that's where handicap accessibility and stuff.
But still, if they're not accessible, I've sunk in sand far too many times.
Yeah, and I've pushed you out of sand.
Exactly. I mean, the wheelchair adds a complexity to my life. I always have to ask, if we're going somewhere, is it handicap accessible? Or, I'm fortunate that we have a van that accommodates my wheelchair. And when we are having car trouble, it's not like I can just hop in your car and go somewhere instead. Or I can, fortunately here in Mount Pleasant, there are cab services that are handicap accessible. But they're kind of hard to come by. And
it's not like when we travel. Anybody else who's traveling sans wheelchair, you catch a cab. You do not have to do any pre-planning to find a shuttle that will get you from your airport to your hotel.
So you have to do a little more, and that's hard. It's not hard, impossible. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt, Then that's the other thing, is you're sitting in a wheelchair all day, every day, and there is legitimate pain in your keister. Just, that's why I have this complex rehabilitative technology power chair that tilts in space to get the pressure off my butt, my high knee, so that, I can have pressure relief. But that's a hard thing, and these chairs are expensive, and they're hard to come by, and they're huge. But that's kind of, I don't remember, I was on a tirade there. I think that there's a lot that goes in with the wheelchair, but it is independence. But there are things to think about.
So I'll ask you, and then maybe help others who are listening. At what point did you when did you decide that the wheelchair would become that this is like, okay, I can't use a walker anymore, I need a wheelchair? And what was that process like?
For me, the process of becoming completely wheelchair dependent, if you want, I think that's the easiest and most politically correct way to say it. I was walking with a walker, and I was falling, quite often, and not little stumbles. I'm 5'9", and I'm not your thinnest person, I'm not your heaviest person, but when I fell, it took a lot to get me up, and I needed assistance because I was very weak because of my MS. But when I was falling, it just seemed not safe. And I'm going to be perfectly honest, and this may be one of my largest regrets. When I was walking, I walked very slowly. And so it seemed like the wheelchair, which I used a scooter, if you know what a 3-wheeled chair looks like, where you like a scooter.
Yep.
I used that because it helped me do things so much more quickly. I would be able to, I could drive still and get my scooter in a van, and I would be able to go to the grocery store, go to the mall. And so I became a little more dependent on it, and I didn't walk as much as I should have. But in all honesty, I could not walk without falling. And when it just started becoming so frequent and so scary, that's when I talked to my doctor about getting a prescription for a wheelchair. And he was hesitant to give me that prescription for a chair because he really was worried that once he gave me one, I would never walk again. And unfortunately, that's what happened. But I remember saying to him, but doctor, I'm so tired. And it's so hard for me to walk, and I keep falling. And he understood, and he gave me that prescription. And now, 16 years later, I've been in this wheelchair the whole time.
Do you have regrets that you asked, or do you think that it was just inevitable that you would need to use? I mean, because your legs don't work. I mean,
my legs don't work. That's true. I still have strength. I'm blessed.
Stand, yes.
I'm blessed that I can still stand and make like a little pivot as needed with a whole lot of help to transfer. I wish I could walk, and I've done extensive physical therapy, and I've tried to keep moving. I plan on potentially, knock wood, doing some aquatherapy this summer. I haven't given up hope of walking again. And I see things, we all play on Facebook. Be honest out there, everyone plays on Facebook. And I've seen things about exoskeletons that could help people that use a wheelchair, whether they have a spinal cord injury or a disease like MS. I would love for an exoskeleton someday that would help me regain my ability to walk. I never say, oh, I don't miss walking, because I really do. But instead of sitting here and pining for the days that I used to walk, I have to move forward.
And you have, in the sense, as you listed everything, with the traveling, with the graduate school, with the marriage,
right,
and everything. Do you think that what's the one thing that able-bodied people don't understand about wheelchair use?
The one thing, I think there's a number of things people don't understand.
Okay, give me the top three.
I appreciate, but I'm saying that with a little bit of gritted teeth. When people see me with my wheelchair and they're like, oh, you drive that so good. I would never be able to do that. Oh, look at you, getting in those tight spaces. I'm like, dude, don't give me medals. I mean, this is my chair. It'd be like me complimenting you, Dan. Like, oh, Dan, look at how good you walk. Wow, that's impressive. I mean, it just feels, and potentially it's because disability makes people uncomfortable, and they see a woman in a wheelchair and they don't know what to say, and so they want to say, oh, you're a good driver, you did a good, you get into a tight space, or I could never do that. But at times it just kind of bothers me.
And I love your comeback, or your comment back is just saying, oh, you should see our house. Just you've had lots of practice and see all the things, and although that rip on the door there on the wall, that was all me.
That was all you. It's not as easy to drive a wheelchair, but again, like I said, I've had 16 years of experience, and I'm sure there are others of you listening to the radio show that have your own experiences with people talking to you about how great of a wheelchair driver you are.
Or how they wish that, when people don't want to do it. I wish I had one of those.
Yeah, and that's one of those things. I understand. I remember we were out somewhere and it was really hot and I was in my wheelchair, as I always am. and a man saying, "Oh, I wish I had one of those today." And it took everything I had to not reply, "Oh, yeah, well, why don't you take my multiple sclerosis and I'll give you my wheelchair," just to be snarky like that. Because, he was just saying because he was hot and tired and a mobility device would help him. But I was like, yeah, you realize that comes with this wheelchair is multiple sclerosis. So sometimes that's hard to hear.
And is that hard too? I mean, because sometimes when people say, "Oh, you want to race," or how fast does that thing go? I mean, it's just like, are people it's just like, are people just uncomfortable with stuff, or is it because they want to be cute? Or does it depend on the person or situation how it's said?
I think
So
it depends on the person, the situation. But as you and I know, disability makes people uncomfortable. I mean, no one wants to see a person in a wheelchair because it's not the norm. I mean, it's more noticed and present in society. But, a person in a wheelchair has a story. There's a reason that he or she is in it. And maybe it's the person who said the comments attempt at humor or levity or just compassion. They don't know how to say, "Oh, I'm sorry you're in a wheelchair." Or if they said something like that, would the person in the wheelchair be like, "Shut up, this is my independence"? You can't have it. Person in the wheelchair, I'm speaking to myself, you can't always have someone know exactly what to say to us. Because let's be honest, every day I have a different emotion about my wheelchair. 90% of the time I'd like to believe that I'm good, pretty got it under control, but there are those rogue days when I'm like, in a heightened state of frazzledness about this stupid wheelchair that even though it gives me independence, it's a pain in my butt.
In so many ways.
And I don't want to have to deal with it because it is a sign of my disease and of my progressive multiple sclerosis.
Does your wheelchair, I think from the standpoint with MS, and there's a lot of people with MS who's like me, whose disease is invisible. I have an invisible illness. No one can see it. Some people want others to know they have this disease. Others want to keep it quiet. Is your wheelchair like the thing that is the telltale sign that you have a disability?
Yeah, I think it's a telltale sign, but I'm going to turn this back on you and I hope not to offend you.
Please.
But let's say it's 75, 80 degrees in Michigan and you've walked a half mile. Your foot drags and it's pretty obvious that something is wrong with you. Just like me, when I still could walk, I would walk into the mall like everything is perfect. But then I'd shop for a couple hours and walk out of the mall dragging my feet. So that's the progression of the disease, and that's life with chronic illness.
And that, that people would think that I'm drunk. I think that's the thing that I don't like. A, I've got the MS. B, I've got the plantar fasciitis, and so I get tired, my feet drag. We go to a bar, I have like one beer, I get up to go to the bathroom, I stumble. People think I'm drunk, and it's just
or that you're a lightweight.
Yeah, total lightweight, but it's like, no, and you just keep ordering more beer, and
right?
Because I've got a high tolerance.
Yes, sir, you do. But it's one of those things like, why do we care what other people think?
Well, and I think that's always been my question and things. It's just like, why do we care? Because I honestly, I guess it depends on who the people are and what they're thinking. But I guess to sum things up, because I appreciate just the talking about this, because it's just this proverbial thing of being, I'm afraid I'll end up in a wheelchair. I'll ask you, should people be afraid of this?
I don't think they should be afraid of it like it's a boogeyman over your shoulder. I would do your best to stay active, to take a disease-modifying therapy if you have multiple sclerosis, to eat well, to get your exercise, and, stop smoking God, stop smoking if you have multiple sclerosis. You don't need to add any fuel to that fire, but I don't think be afraid. And just, I think everybody is going through some things. We just as a society need to be a little kinder and just a little more understanding and be thankful for the people in society that are really helpful to those of us in wheelchairs.
Is it something, and now I'm just, being all hypothetical stuff, but it's just like, is it some, would it be better for people to phrase it, or just to think that I don't like having this disease, but I'm thankful that they do have wheelchairs in case something should go bad?
Absolutely. I
Because-
think that's great.
Well, because I think you're living proof, and there's so many people out there that's just like, the wheelchair doesn't end life. I mean, it just
No,
it
it
changes
certainly
it.
doesn't. It changes it, but it adds to my life because, again, look at all I've done because of this chair.
You've done a lot.
Yeah,
so.
thank you. And just, I hope we all stay healthy. And even in a wheelchair, I have to watch what I'm eating and take my medicine and just try and stay ahead of this multiple sclerosis.
Wow.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me kind of be
Oh,
the
this is
focus
tough.
of this show today. But I think it's important, and if children or people want to ask questions about a wheelchair, ask them. I would rather have you ask me a question than just stare at me.
Yep.
That's my final 2 cents.
Don't stare.
Well, you can stare, but
Well,
ask.
I do stare, but not. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all again for listening to this, A Couple Takes on MS. This is Dan Digman.
And Jennifer Digman.
And thanks to MS&Me Radio Network for having us on board. And thanks to Blue Draft Kid for composing this music. Check us out at danandjenniferdigman.com or on Twitter at DanGenDig. Take care.